Their bodies were located very close together, almost like they'd been placed there.
There was never a complete answer how the girls died.
Two hunters discover her body lying in the side of the ditch. There was signs that Melissa would have put up a struggle. The cause of death was manual strangulation.
For nearly 50 years, investigators did not give up in their pursuit to identify the man responsible for these murders.
We've identified a serial killer.
This man was the kind of the poster boy for a sexual predator.
He used at least 9 different aliases during his lifetime.
I can't help but keep thinking, even to this day, how many do we not know about?
Welcome to Crime Beat. I'm Anthony Robart. In the late 1970s, a series of mysterious deaths left families and police searching for answers. Decades later, a team of tenacious cold case investigators took over using the latest forensic techniques. But no one was prepared for the horrors they discovered. Here now is Nancy Hixt with Uncovering a Serial Killer.
Thursday, February 12th, 1976 was a typically snowy and cold winter day. Inside a southeast Calgary junior high school, the weekend seemed far away for best friends Eva Dvorak and Patsy McQueen. The teenagers skipped class, hid out in the girls' washroom, and cracked open a bottle of alcohol.
The principal had caught them. She phoned the parents to come and pick up the girls because they were getting expelled and going home. They knew that they were going to be punished.
Yeah, we'd get grounded for like a month. And Patsy and Eva went out the back door and left the school before Mom and Dad got there. We were phoning friends to see if we could find her anywhere, but back then everybody was so tight that nobody would tell you anything either, right? Because they didn't want to get the girls in trouble.
Their families tried not to panic. They figured the girls would show up later that night.
Even if we did do something wrong and went and stayed at somebody's place, it would be just for that night.
That's what we were all hoping for, that she would just come to one of our houses, and that didn't happen.
I know Mom and Dad were up most of the night.
The police were alerted.
They showed up at the school, like into the classroom where Patsy and Eva were, and they asked everybody if what they had heard, if they knew where the girls were going to be, what was happening, and that's how they found out about the party.
There was a party on a Friday night, and my brothers went there. But by the time my brothers got there, she was no longer there.
Saturday came and went, and Eva and Patsy's families still hadn't heard from either of them.
So panic did set in, and I felt my heart, something terrible happened to her.
We all got called on Sunday morning, and we were all just told to come to my parents' house.
At that moment, I knew something was very wrong.
We felt it, that something bad had happened to her.
My father's brother was one of the detectives that came to the house to tell my dad.
The officer told them Eva and Patsy had been found dead that morning, west of the city.
Just chaos and cries. I've never seen my mom cry like that in my whole life.
Everybody screaming, like we couldn't believe that that actually happened to her, that she was gone.
Eva and Patsy were found near an area they'd visited many times with their families to camp or picnic. But how Eva and Patsy got to the Happy Valley underpass or how they died was a mystery.
This is a well-traveled road even back in 1976, and there was actually a Calgary Police Service officer had actually driven through that area on a completely unrelated call. He was actually looking for deer that were reported to be in the area and on the road. So we know that he drove by this area at 10:15 in the morning, and the girls were found by just another passing motorist at 10:50 in the morning. So it's a very tight timeline from when we know for a fact the girls weren't there and when they actually were found by a motorist. Their bodies were located very close together, almost, when you look at the pictures, almost, cuddled together. They were fully clothed at the time, although some of their clothing did appear to be somewhat disheveled, almost like they'd been placed there. A full-scale investigation was immediately launched into who were these girls, where did they come from, how did they end up here, and of course, how and why did they die. They located a witness who recognized the girls and actually had interactions with them up to the point where they disappeared. They were able to confirm that the girls were in the Inglewood area walking towards the downtown core of Calgary on 9th Avenue and 12th Street Southeast.
The witness reported seeing Eva and Patsy alive at about 12 a.m. on February 15th, approximately 10 hours before they were found dead. But investigators were at a loss to determine what happened during those 10 hours. Autopsies failed to give police any further insight.
The medical examiner, he's still alive today, Dr. John Butts, they actually examined them twice and they could not find any type of cause or manner of death. They had some theories. They believed that could it have been a intentional or unintentional drug overdose.
I remember there was some difficulty establishing the cause of death. We thought originally that it was a toxicologically related death, that is by some chemical substance that they had perhaps even willingly ingested.
Later on that year, on September 20th of 1976, they actually held a coroner's inquiry, which they held before a jury to try and see if they could have all the information known at the time reanalyzed to see if they could determine that manner or cause of death. At the end, the medical examiner determined that the cause of death would be asphyxia, but they could never put in any type of report what would have caused the asphyxia.
I can tell you this, asphyxia, particularly smothering, is a difficult diagnosis to make. Undetermined means that it's not known whether it's a suicide, an accident, or a homicide. And so that's a good category for the deaths.
But for Eva and Patsy's families, it wasn't enough.
Well, we did have so many questions, but they always gave us so much runaround, like, maybe they were suffocated, maybe they were this, maybe they were that. Nobody could ever give us an answer. Like, there was never a complete answer how the girls died.
Mom and Dad always knew there was more to it. Always.
In the spring of 1976, wanderlust led a young woman to move west from Ontario. 20-year-old Melissa Rehorick had always been drawn to the splendor of Banff and the Rockies, so she packed up to live just over an hour away from endless mountain adventures.
She was working, she was a housekeeper at a local hotel, she was staying at the YWCA, but she loved to travel and she loved to explore things, and she had a fascination with just kind of heading out and just being on her own. She was absolutely known to be an avid hitchhiker. She was even known that she liked being picked up by truck drivers. She kept a journal of her interactions and her adventures that she would have while she was out hitchhiking, as she liked to do.
A few months later, on the evening of September 15th, 1976, Melissa finished her housekeeping shift and made plans to leave town for her days off.
From what she told her friends at the YWCA was that she was excited to go just adventure west of town.
She took a bus to the western edge of the city, close to the Trans-Canada Highway, where she could easily hitch a ride to Banff. That was the last time Melissa Rehorick was seen alive.
It's the following morning. It's September 16th. Two hunters are actually in the area about 22 kilometers west of the city when they actually discover her body lying in the side of the ditch. The ditch was a little bit higher than most typical gravel roads with a long, steep embankment. but she was lying there by herself with her purse about 30 feet away.
Police said the circumstances were suspicious.
There was signs on this gravel road that Melissa would have put up a struggle, and what I mean by that is they could see footprints in the gravel and in the dirt that looked like two people were fighting, right? So like dragged foot impressions, multiple different directions.
An autopsy was completed and the cause of death was deemed to be asphyxia from manual strangulation. Samples were also gathered for forensic testing.
So the forensic evidence that they're looking for at the time would be the seminal fluid that they're obtaining from Melissa's clothing and also through swabs off of her body.
At that time, there was no DNA testing, and despite an exhaustive investigation, no suspects were identified. A little over 5 months later, police were called to an eerily similar scene. The area looks much different now, running parallel to the main north-south highway in the city of Calgary. In 1977, it was not yet developed and was north of the city limits.
The man who found her was walking her dog, which we learned was a common activity that's what would take people to the place back in the day before they'd finished the roads, but it was just a sad, cold gravel pit. She was fully clothed. Her jacket was also found to be inside out. The cause of death was manual strangulation. She had marks and abrasions consistent with being involved in a physical struggle or a fight. You know, it looked like she'd been punched in the mouth. It looked like she had wounds on her fingers, probably of her trying to fight off her attacker. There was no obvious signs of sexual assault, meaning there was no wounds or injuries to her body that would suggest that. But there was, once again, the presence of seminal fluid.
The victim was identified as 19-year-old Barbara McLean.
Barbara McLean, a young girl from Nova Scotia, you know, she moves out here in September of 1976. She comes out to Calgary. She gets a job working at a local bank downtown. She gets a boyfriend, and she just starts living her life in the city.
Police retraced her steps.
She ended up going to the Highlander bar on February 25th, 1977. She was there with her boyfriend and friends. It was a good night, but it ended up going downhill a bit. She got into a verbal argument with her boyfriend at the time, which led to her, you know, basically walking out of the cabaret that they were attending that night at the Highlander.
That area has changed a lot over the years.
But there's a Home Depot there now, but back in 1977, it would have been a completely different feel, completely different environment.
The bustling Trans-Canada Highway was at that time a much quieter thoroughfare. Witness accounts varied. Some said Barbara walked off. Others thought she got into a cab.
Hundreds of taxi cab drivers were interviewed trying to figure out that did one of them pick up Barbara. In the end, they could never conclusively say that a taxi cab had anything to do with Barbara's death.
An autopsy revealed Barbara McLean died from asphyxiation by manual strangulation, the same manner as Melissa Rehorick.
So Barbara and Melissa's cases, right from the moment that Barbara's body was found, investigators immediately thought that they were linked to one another. There were so many similarities that it was their investigational theory from the onset that the person responsible for Melissa's death was in fact the same person related to Barbara.
Investigators gathered forensic evidence from both cases. But again, technology didn't exist to develop a DNA profile of the killer. Hundreds of persons of interest were looked at, but no viable suspects were identified. The murders of Melissa Rehorick and Barbara McLean went cold.
Welcome back to Crime Beat. Between 1976 and 1977, 4 young women were found dead. their bodies dumped on the outskirts of Calgary. 2 were deemed undetermined deaths. The other 2 were homicides. Now, it would be nearly 50 years before there was a break in the case. And the truth was so much worse than anyone imagined. Here again is Nancy Hixt with Uncovering a Serial Killer.
So we're just days away from the anniversary, eh?
Yeah.
Over the years, countless cold case investigators have looked into the murders of Melissa Rehorick and Barbara McLean. They've revisited each crime scene and reviewed even the most minute details.
These trees would have changed, right? All these trees are new growth poplars. There's lots of bushes and shrubs. All the growth is new, but the road itself, I mean, like literally, like we're standing on the same gravel road, you know, that she was found in. Melissa's roommates knew that she was heading out for the weekend, and she had talked to them that she was planning to head out to the mountains. More than likely she was going to hitchhike because that was her method of travel when she was kind of heading off on her own. And then, you know, 22 kilometers directly west is where we find her on this road.
26 years after the 2 murders, advancements in science finally confirmed what police had always suspected.
In 2003, the DNA samples that were recovered from Melissa and Barbara were tested, and they were both confirmed to be an exact genetic match to one unknown male offender. So what that tells us is the same person who had left their seminal fluid on Melissa was the same one with Barbara. We were looking for one person.
But the killer continued to elude investigators. Despite having his DNA, his identity remained a mystery.
And it makes you start wondering, why don't we? What happened to this person? How has it been decades without this person ending up on our national database for DNA? And it's disheartening, but it keeps the investigators focused and still wanting to drive the file forward.
Then there were the deaths of Patsy McQueen and Eva Dvorak. Their cases were not considered murders, but rather classified as undetermined.
No, it was not painted as a murder. It was painted as these girls were out partying and had drugs in their system.
Instead of compassion or sympathy, their siblings faced disdain and criticism.
Very judgmental, that they deserved what they got and all of that kind of talk. Kids are the meanest.
But Patsy and Eva's families never believed that they had overdosed.
We just always knew something happened to them. Somebody did this, somebody did this to them.
I remember my dad saying, somebody has done something wrong to these girls. And I believe he feared that somebody had murdered them.
So this is your sister?
So yes, this is Eva. She might have been 10 or 11 at that time.
Okay.
As an adult, Anita Vukovic-Kohut had Googled her sister's name many times.
It was nagging at me. It always has been. It's always been at the back of my head. I looked up on the internet over the years to see if there was any updates that maybe would come out.
Anita was only 2 months old when Eva Dvorak was found dead.
My mom had 3 girls, Zsezsa, Martha, and Eva. Martha was the oldest, Eva was the middle, and Zsezsa was the youngest. And then after their father passed, and she met my dad, I came along. I'm definitely the timestamp of when it happened. I only know life after. I just remember Mom speaking about her, and you know, Zsezsa and Martha would talk about some memories about just playing and having fun. Mom would always talk about how cute she was. She described her like a little cherub. She was loving. She had the biggest, warmest heart.
Growing up, Anita struggled with not knowing what caused her sister's death.
The whole time, the story was that nobody knew how they passed. And I think people suspected that maybe it was an accident, and They were last seen at a party, so maybe everybody freaked out and kind of left the bodies somewhere.
46 years after their deaths, in the fall of 2022, Anita reached out to police.
I spoke to an officer, and when I did talk to him, he was so kind and so understanding about everything, and he even said to me, "I can't believe you're calling me right now, because we're looking into this right now." I don't know what the trigger was that got them to start looking into it, but when I asked about it, they had already begun the process.
The RCMP said just 2 months earlier, they had received a tip that spurred a review of Eva and Patsy's case.
It certainly was investigated, but turned out to be a dead end. What it was is, as an inmate, Correctional Services of Canada had found Patsy's name written in the person's some paperwork that they had, so they passed it on, and we're like, yeah, we'll definitely investigate it. No, it turned out the person certainly was not responsible for her death, but actually, for our understanding, is did know her, or at least have know of her. Really what it did is the investigator, took that file, opened it up, and said, you know what? There are exhibits that we have not analyzed in several years that we can send these off, and maybe with the advances in technology, we're going to get a hit.
But results of forensic testing would take months. Eva and Patsy's families had no idea what to expect, given their deaths were not considered homicides. Nothing could have prepared the two families for what they would soon find out.
Here's the actual RCMP report.
Oh, that's the original, I think.
Calgary Police cold case detectives work to give closure to families of historical unsolved homicides.
We do feel that all victims deserve answers.
The two detectives were inspired by the investigators who caught California's Golden State Killer using investigative genetic genealogy, and now use the same technique.
There were a number of files where DNA existed, but there was no resolution. We have perpetrator DNA that is unknown. All reasonable leads have been taken in these investigations, and we're at an end point. Rather than randomly, selecting people to compare against that crime scene sample, it was time to take a more reasonable step, and that led us to IGG.
By about mid-2020, out of our office, my partner and I had already used this technique to solve 2 of our cases. And so we began looking at other Calgary cases, and we found that there were a lot of Calgary victims who were dumped outside the city of Calgary limits. And those cases were RCMP files. And so we approached the RCMP in January of 2021, and we offered to conduct the IGG portion of their investigations to help them move these cases forward, because we felt that we had obligations to the Calgary victims.
And so began a partnership with the RCMP to look at the murders of Melissa Rahoric and Barbara McLean, which they knew were linked to the same offender nearly 20 years earlier.
So we, as in CPS, uploaded that profile to the genealogical databases, and we performed what we would call the traditional investigative genetic genealogy work in that case to develop a possible candidate for that DNA.
IGG opens up opportunities because we're not looking for the offender in an IGG data bank. What we're looking for is kinship, to hopefully give a hypothesis or a lead as to who that person may be.
The databank provided a long list of names, thousands of people who shared even the smallest amount of the killer's DNA. At Calgary Police Headquarters, detectives worked with investigative genetic genealogists to build out family trees. It was an exhaustive work that ultimately created a tree with 6,400 people, dating back to the early 1700s. After 11 weeks of digging, they identified the possible killer.
We were able to provide enough information so that we can identify a person, actually a number of brothers, 3 brothers, that would be in the right location in the tree, and then from there they are prioritized very quickly based on information from the media, truthfully, about one of the brothers being a serial rapist. And that, of course, led him to be the number one suspect.
And we identified Gary Swery on February 1st and provided that name to the RCMP on 2023.
With a suspect identified, the work was far from over. The RCMP needed to verify that Gary Swery was responsible for killing Melissa Rehoric and Barbara McLean.
Gary Allen Swery became the number one focus on our investigation of figuring out who he was and where he was from and what type of person he was.
We know that he was born in 1942 in Oak Park, Illinois, which is just outside of Chicago. And we know that he moved to California with his family in the mid-1950s when he was about 10 years old.
He graduated high school. He was described as being charming, charismatic, good at drama. He was offered scholarships because apparently his IQ was incredibly high. It was said to be 160. However, he turned down these scholarships. He graduated high school, was almost immediately married, had 4 children, but struggled finding any type of meaningful employment, working jobs as a cook or reportedly as a salesman, but like a traveling salesman in the 60s and 70s.
As a young adult, Swery got into crime. First, petty theft, then he was convicted of rape, sodomy, and kidnapping. By the time he was 23, he was classified as a mentally disordered sex offender in California. He was a prolific offender, and he spent time in and out of custody, including incarceration in San Quentin prison. While facing charges of rape in the mid-70s, Gary Swery posted bail. That's when police believe he fled to Canada.
We don't know what brought him to Calgary, although I think it's safe to say that he was going to face a significant jail sentence for committing those sexual assaults in the United States.
There's a couple of factors at play, and I think that it was very fortuitous for him to be living at that time, because in the 70s it was very easy to come across the United States-Canada border. In some places it was almost an open border, and even if there were border stations, sometimes they were unmanned at night, even after hours. So I think it was easy for him to come across the border, but also easy for him at that time to just go in and, you know, possibly say I lost my ID or something along those lines. It was easy probably to obtain ID in another name at that time, and once he did that, he was off to the races with getting Social Security in that name and establishing an identity for himself in Canada.
Police learned Swery was a chameleon.
He had beard, no beard, sometimes a mustache, long hair, short hair. So he changed his appearance quite a bit over the course of several years. He changed his vehicles. He was able to change his job because he worked at transient jobs.
We were able to piece together through interviewing his family and former partners that he was living in Calgary in the mid-1970s. And in fact, we know that he was living almost directly straight downtown at the time as well, 16th Avenue and Center Street. We know that he was able to maintain relationships with females, some even long-term.
Police believe Swery spent 20 years in Canada before he was arrested and convicted for a violent sexual assault in New Westminster, British Columbia. Following his sentence in 2003, Swery was ordered deported to the USA. He was escorted to the Peace Arch border crossing and met by his own family, who drove him to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Just 5 years later, in 2008, he violently raped another woman and was sentenced to life in prison.
Throughout his lifetime, we know for a fact that he sexually assaulted 8 women who survived their attacks. These attacks, of course, started in 1965 and continued up to the year 2003. These women who were able to survive were able to identify him as their attacker, and Their accounts were incredibly important for us trying to determine the criminality associated to Gary Allen Sweary.
This photo here was taken in 1972.
As investigators in Alberta continued to retrace Sweary's movements, the RCMP received results of forensic testing from Eva Dvorak and Patsy McQueen's case.
We were able to actually show that the same seminal fluid that was found on Eva and Patsy were linked to 2 other homicides that happened in the area later on in 1976 and early 1977.
Eva Dvorak and Patsy McQueen did not die from an overdose. DNA results confirmed Eva and Patsy were murdered, and the killer was the same man who killed Melissa Rahorik and Barbara McLean.
It's truly significant. It's at this point we've identified a serial killer who was operating within the city of Calgary in the province of Alberta in the mid-1970s.
Welcome back. Nearly 50 years after 4 young women were murdered, investigators learned one man was responsible for all 4 homicides. In an exclusive interview, the killer's family provides insight on the aliases, manipulation, and charm he used, and why there are likely more victims. Here now is Nancy Hixt with a conclusion of uncovering a serial killer.
In the spring of 2024, the RCMP gathered the families of Eva Dvorak and Patsy McQueen together to tell them their loved ones were murdered and they were victims of a serial killer.
That's something you never thought you'd hear.
Especially when they used the word serial killer and then proceeded to tell us about the other 2 women that were involved. We had no idea.
It was a big shock to the system. It was a shock to find out then not only how they died, but how brutal it was. I pray to God in my brain that they were drugged and they were unaware of what happened to them. That's what I'm hoping for, and that's what will get me through it.
Until then, Eva and Patsy's siblings had no idea there were bodily fluids found on their clothing, and that the 2 teens had been raped and murdered.
Like, we were in shock because when they said they were sexually abused or there was semen on their clothing, it was like we didn't know any of that.
That was the furthest thing from my thoughts, is that they were sexually assaulted and strangled.
I just can't believe how he could go under the radar all the time and move from here to there. And I'm sure that there's going to be more cases come up.
Were Sweary alive today, he would be 81 years old.
The RCMP announcement that Sweary was responsible for the murders of Eva Dvorak, Patsy McQueen, Melissa Rahorik, and Barbara McLean made international headlines.
Sweary fled from the U.S. sometime during 1974 after posting bail for a rape charge in California. He lived under the aliases in Calgary in 1976 and 1977 that included, but were not limited to, Willie Blackman and Rex Long. He used at least 9 different aliases during his lifetime. The Alberta RCMP have not associated him to any other unsolved homicides, either through forensic evidence or witness accounts.
One of the places RCMP say Gary Sweary lived is Standard, Alberta, a tiny farming community of only a few hundred people northeast of Calgary, a place put on the map by a shocking kidnapping and murder in 1981. That case remains unsolved, and news of Sweary's history in Alberta prompted immediate questions from the victim's family.
Yeah, it's bizarre. And if he lived in Standard in 1977 or 78, he provenly had already killed 4 girls.
But police say that's simply a coincidence.
So Mom got a call from the RCMP to specifically tell her that he was not responsible for Kelly. And honestly, in 43 years, we'd never received a phone call like that. They said it was hitting the news the following day, and to basically relax about the fact that he was not responsible.
Early in the morning of Wednesday, April 22nd, 1981, a man who identified himself as Bill Christensen phoned to ask Kelly Cook to babysit for him that night. Hours later, a car pulled up to the house, Kelly ran out, got into the vehicle, and the car drove away. That was the last time she was seen alive.
The man who abducted Kelly Cook. He may very well live in this area.
The days that followed were consumed with frantic searches. Just over 2 months later, Kelly's body was found on the shore of Chin Lake. Beyond the fact that Sreri had previously lived in Standard, there are other details, including a sketch of Kelly's killer, that make it hard for her family to believe it's all just a coincidence.
It's eerie how there is resemblance. And I've never seen that with anybody else that maybe has been a suspicion to anybody.
But RCMP do not believe it was him. They maintain there's holdback evidence, details of the crime that have never been released, and that they say will eventually help them to identify the killer.
The pattern of criminality that Gary Sreri presented over, the course of his life with of course, 8 victims who survived the attack, and of course our 4 victims who didn't, is very different than with Kelly Cook. So when we take a look at the pattern of behavior, number one, all of Sreri's crimes seem to be opportunistic. Whereas the difference with Kelly Cook is there seemed to be a lot of planning and premeditation. Sreri didn't ever take any attempts to hide or conceal his victims, where with Kelly Cook, we do know that significant effort was made to conceal her after her abduction.
I disagree with that. If he wanted the first girl that he phoned, when she told him she wasn't available, he would have hung around and waited for an opportunity or a time that he could take her. But instead, that morning, he phoned Kelly that morning and took her that night. Short of grabbing her off the street, that's the only point of it not being an opportunity. 100% it was an opportunity. She's a victim of an opportunity.
Until Kelly's case is solved, her family will always wonder who was responsible. And without the DNA evidence that solved the other 4 cases, they may never know for sure.
I'm not aware of any actual DNA that has actually ever been recovered on this file.
Unfortunately, the man who had the answers is no longer alive. Gary Sreri died of natural causes while serving a life sentence at Idaho State Correctional Center. But one man knows Gary Sreri all too well, his son.
He is one of the most charismatic, convincing, intellectual people I have actually ever encountered. Knowing all the things I know now and looking at that, it's kind of eerie. Because part of me says, God, what a waste of an intellect, obviously. But at the same time, it's like he utilized that intellect and that charm to coerce people to doing things that became then his victims. And that's horrific. I can't help but keep thinking, even to this day, how many do we not know about?
Gary Sreri's son helped police come up with several known aliases. He saw many growing up used in letters sent to his family. He says one of those is the name Kelly Cook's killer used.
Well, Dan and Bill Christensen would be 2 of them for sure. Willie Long I saw a lot of, as well as Rex Long.
Sweary's son is convinced his father killed Kelly Cook.
When I first interviewed with the Canadian police, so after I had agreed to talk to them, they eventually flew down here and met with me in person and did an interview and got some information from me as well. They had told me about the 4 people they were investigating. Well, before they got here, I had went online and started researching deaths in Canada, because I didn't know at the time before they got here who they were talking about. And I came across the documentary on Hulu about this person and watched the whole documentary on her, and I was convinced from watching it, this is him, this is the one that they're going to talk to me about. And when they came here and they didn't mention her name at first, they were talking about these 4 other victims, I even said, well, what about her? And they said, well, we haven't made the connection yet, is what they told me. I said, I can't imagine why not. He lived there. There's the aliases. I mean, everything about it just adds up. It's like, okay, I understand you're doing your job and you're an investigator and you might look at things slightly different, but if it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's got feathers like a duck. I mean, how much more of a duck do you need to draw this conclusion? I mean, I've seen people on television, on the news, being convicted of things on circumstantial evidence far weaker than what is pointing here. And I'd be hard pressed unless you had some specific DNA evidence at some point that said it wasn't him, right? That would be the only way I'd be convinced it's not him at this point.
The RCMP claims there's no mention of the alias Bill Christensen in the Swery file and maintains there's no evidence that connects Swery to Kelly Cook's murder.
I'll always be open-minded. I have one of those guys who never say never, but at this point in time, we don't believe that he would be connected to her death.
The RCMP's lead criminal investigative psychologist, Dr. Matt Logan, conducted a posthumous forensic behavioral analysis on Swery.
There were a number of key findings. I think one of the most key findings was his level of psychopathy. This man was the kind of the poster boy for a sexual predator. He had way more than 3 or more offenses that included sadism. And one of the elements of sadism for Swery was his need to humiliate. He would do things to the victims that were very humiliating. And after he would finish with them, he would actually tell them to get dressed, or in the cases of the women that he actually murdered, he would dress them again, which we don't see that often.
Dr. Logan said it was challenging for him to figure out why Swery killed some of his victims while others survived.
In this case, we don't have those answers, and I'm convinced that he probably had murder victims south of the border as well.
Historical homicide detectives in Canada continue to work through unsolved cases to determine if Swery is connected to any other murders.
To be honest, the day that we found out, it was like burying her all over again.
Both Eva and Patsy's parents passed away years before DNA confirmed their daughters had been murdered by Gary Swery.
He took a piece of all of us when he took her, and that will never heal. That part of it will never heal for any of us.
But after years of speculation, they've found some peace in finally knowing the truth.
I'm glad you're doing this with us today, because now we can tell them that they were just typical teenage girls.
I think the only good thing that came out of this for all the families was that he can no longer hurt anybody else.
Police say Gary Swery would go for long drives, cruising to find his next victim. They believe there could be more survivors of sexual assault, as well as other murder victims. Anyone who knew him or has information is asked to contact the RCMP. Thank you for joining us tonight on Crime Beat. I'm Anthony Robart. Want more episodes of Crime Beat? Listen to the Crime Beat podcast now for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your favorite podcast. And for past episodes of Crime Beat, go to the Global TV app, visit globaltv.com, or check out our Crime Beat YouTube page.